All right, hello everyone. There's somebody at my door. I have to run, so Jeff's gonna intro us. Hello everyone.
Well, that's weird and awkward. So I get to figure out what to talk about here for a few minutes. So I don't know who all's out in the audience, but I'm just have enjoyed interacting with Mike. It's kind of Michael. It's actually kind of funny because the genesis of this podcast was during kind of leading up to the pandemic. Shortly after, I would go over and work at UCLA, and we'd get together and talk just for various things. So we'd sit out around the park bench or whatever, and just have these conversations about theology, about science, about whatever. And it was just, they were fascinating discussions. We get started about something and talk for a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour about it. We thought, hey, these are good discussions. I wonder if we could do. So this is part of what we're doing, is bringing some of those conversations before you. As you might guess, these aren't like polished. We've thought about, okay, here are the 5 points we want to make. But what I do think is really important, especially as a Christian, is to be able to think about things, to ask deep questions. I think honestly, that's what drove a lot of the development of the scientific enterprise, is just asking questions, thinking about what the answers are, being willing to go in and do the work to explore the answers, come back and say, all right, hey, we know more now. What's still interesting out there? What can we know? What are the questions we can have? So hopefully, and then listening to Michael and I, you've gotten a sense of that, just fascination with how the universe works, because we live in a spectacular universe. In fact, just coming up tomorrow, I've got a James Webb Space Telescope workshop where we're just talking about what the James Webb is showing us. So hopefully you find that fascinating. And now that Michael's back, I don't just have to sit here and monologue for a while.
Put you on the spot. Sorry. All right, let's do this. Hold on a second. Let's do this the normal way. We're gonna rewind and start fresh. Here we go.
Hello, everyone. He's Jeff.
And he's Michael.
And that's totally corny.
All right. Who is that guy? Who's that other guy? That guy, Michael. That guy. Who is that?
That's odd.
Okay. You were asking about the hair and beard before I left, before we went live.
My gather is that's something intentional.
Yeah, it's intentional. It's intentional, but I can't tell you.
All right. Fair enough.
I can. I mean, there's a number of, there's multiple layers of why this is happening, but I'm not going to go into those details.
All right.
We have limited time.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So you're the one that came up with the topic for this week's show. What were you thinking here with time? What do you find fascinating about the issue of time?
Okay. Oh, Carrie's like, you look great in that video. The beard is a trip. Yeah. Thank you. Hold on a second. In that video, not this video, but that other. All right, just glancing at some people in here. Hi, John Walsh. Do we know you? I haven't seen you before, I don't think. All right. What was your question? Oh, why did I pick this topic?
Yeah.
A number of reasons. I mean, you being in your particular line of work, an astrophysicist studying dark matter and etc. Have stipulated or illuminated that there's multiple dimensions, right? I mean, not just the three, height, width, and depth, but then there's the fourth dimension, time, but then there's another 6 or 7 dimensions and another dimension of time potentially, right? So that's one reason I was thinking about it. Another thought was, because you are a progressive creationist, and then there's the young Earth creationist, right? There's the idea that the Earth is only 6 to 20,000 years old, whatever the range is for the young Earth, but then there's the idea that it's 4.5 billion. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the universe is like 13 billion, something like that.
Closer to 14, but
13, 14. Okay, 14 billion. So there's that discrepancy and that disparity. And I understand a lot of the reasons for those differences. And it's mainly a difference in biblical interpretation. But in my daily reading yesterday, we came across the Joshua chapter 10.
mm,
And the sun stands still for like 10 hours or something like that.
mhm.
And so every time I come across that, I'm like, okay, what is going on here? So my first question in that regard, and we'll get to other aspects of this in a sec, but in that situation, I've come, to the, the understanding myself is it's either God has there's the appearance of time,
Mhm.
right? There's some kind of acceleration thing that God is able to do, this elasticity, so that we just perceive that time has passed, and but it's just the nature of, and then there's also God is outside of the created
Mhm.
order and can do what he wants and can shut everything down for 10 hours and it not be recorded in the physical record or something, right?
Right.
Like it's one of, there's some, or it's a hyperbole used in scripture. I don't know, right? The scriptures, there's a few
Yeah.
things that are kind of stumbling blocks to, astrophysics, at least on the surface.
Well, it is funny there because, as a, I don't know what it says as a physicist, but at least part of my interest in doing physics is, okay, I see something that I don't understand. How do I go about understanding it? And so, yeah, that passage there of Joshua's long day, oddly enough, I just read it within the past couple of weeks as well. And, there's this clearly the point of the passage is God is working for the nation of Israel, that as Joshua is going in and they're pursuing and doing what he's asked and following him, he's clearing out the people, judging the people of that land, and bringing Israel into the promised land because this is where he's told them they would be. So, I mean, that's clearly the focus of the passage. But now you get this description where, and I forget exactly how it's read, or how it's stated in there, but it seems like, what should be night is now it's daylight, or it's light enough that they can continue fighting, and the route continues in there. And I'm with you. There's either their perception of time is off, or one of two things could be playing out. One, God could just say, all right, the universe normally operates this way. We're just going to make it stand still here for a little bit. So instead of the earth and the moon and everything revolving, it's just going to stay still there. And,
Like
given,
suspend everything just for this period or something,
yeah,
right?
given that God's God, I mean, he's the one who created and upholds the universe, that he can do that without catastrophic consequences.
Right.
Or, and then I see actually two other options in there. One, it could be that there's some unusual phenomena that makes, because what it's a phenomenological description. The sun stood still in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So, when we look at the sun, I mean, we can now with the telescope see whether we're actually looking at the object or not. But I could imagine something, if it was an overcast day, what does the sun standing still in the sky mean? Does the sun physically have to be there, or are there phenomena which makes it look like the sun is in the same place? I could see something like that going on there. And actually, one that I thought was interesting, and I put this in the class, or all of these in the class of, there's ways to interpret this. I don't know
Right.
what's actually going on there,
Right.
but
Thank you for your honesty, but we got to speculate. Yeah.
one that was interesting was that there may have been some sort of solar eclipse that happened,
Mm.
where, when it's talking about days and nights, that phenomenologically a day is when the sun comes up and the sun goes and it gets dark again. And so it could very well be where you've got this eclipse where it's dark, but you can still see, I mean, we just saw that at the solar eclipse back in April, that even in the midst of totality, you can still see a little bit, enough that you could fight or whatever. And so it may be that somewhere in the middle of the day you had this eclipse, and so it looked like you fought over 2 days, given the phenomenology of what determines a day, but in reality it was. So, I mean, I got 4 different possibilities of what might be going on here. I really don't know which one's going on. I have my guess is what I thought. I like this one the best, but if you put a gun to my head and said, "Hey, choose," I'm like, I don't know. They could.
I don't know. Shoot me.
Nothing.
I anticipated that would be your response, and it is. One day we will know clearly, right? There's a time coming where that's when well, okay, Jesus, what happened here, right? It's like we go back through scripture. All right, what's this again? Now, what is this? We have eternity to go through that, right? So, well, we're just speculating ahead of time.
Just see there sitting in there, and he goes, "Well, hey, I did it. There was this weird ice cloud in
Something
Asia.
none of us even thought of.
Over." I'm like, "Oh, that's so cool."
Okay, so I didn't want to spend the whole time on that, but that's what that's why I thought of the topic. Now, here's one of the things I was thinking about, and this I meditate on this quite a bit. No, according to astrophysics, and for the equations to work, right? The 11 dimensions or the 10 dimensions of the physical universe, right? For the equations to work, that's the basically the conclusion. And I don't know, is it definitive that one of those is another dimension of time? Is that like pretty set, or that's speculation?
So typically the way I hear that talked about, and this is again, the motivation for doing this just briefly is we got quantum mechanics, which is a very good description of every place we've thrown to test at, it's shown with flying colors. We've got general relativity, which is a description of the dynamics of gravity and how it works. And every test we've thrown at it, it's passed with flying colors. The problem is when you start and say, all right, we got gravity, we've got quantum mechanics, or quantum mechanics and gravity, and try and put them together, they don't work unless if you have more physical dimensions, and they need to be tied up really, or wound up really tightly. Unless you have those extra dimensions, you can't make it work. So that's the idea behind the extra dimensions. If you're
got it.
say, do they exist? I would say most likely. That being said, we don't have any experimental evidence that says, yeah, this is the way it is. So with that caveat, most of the time when I hear them talking about those dimensions, they're talking just about spatial dimensions, not time. Now, you got to be aware that when physicists are talking about time and space dimensions, those are not as distinct as we would like them to be. In fact, as physicists, we talk about space-time, not space and time, because how you move affects how time goes and vice versa. So it's far more complicated than our layman everyday experience of it.
Well, I remember sitting in your office one day, and you just said this simple statement, and just struck me. I know I'd heard it before, but it was just that moment was like, that's crazy. The faster you move through space, the slower you move through time, right? Or the faster. It's like, wait, what? It's like it's like mind bending to think that it is a reality that they are related.
Yeah, and contrary to my statement about whether there are more than those extra dimensions, if we don't account for that phenomena, our cell phones don't work, our particle this is like there's an abundance of evidence that says, yeah, this is the way the world actually works. In fact, there's a really simple experiment. Well, simple
for you.
Experiment. Yeah. Well, I actually had my daughter did this experiment for her science fair project, because you got to have a few pieces of electronics that'll do it.
Yeah. But she had a little help, huh? Did she have any?
Well, little help to get it going, but my rule was you actually have to understand it. You don't get to just say, "Well, my dad said this." It's like you got to be able to articulate what's going on in there. But there are certain types of particles that we know only live for a certain amount of time. We know that they're produced in the upper atmosphere, and if you say how long do they live, compared to, or if you say how long do they live and what's the time it takes them to get to the earth, we find out that lo and behold, they can't get to the surface of the earth, but yet we can measure them on the surface of the earth. We know they're produced in the upper atmosphere. We can measure them on the surface of the earth. And unless time, so the faster you move through space, the slower you move through time, unless time was dilated like that, you would not be able to measure them. So there's an abundance of evidence that points to, yeah, this is the way reality actually is.
Got it. All right. Um, well, I don't shifting maybe slightly. Maybe I'll let you determine how much of a shift this is. In my personal experience, in my human experience, and my devotional, my love and meditation for the Lord, it seems to me pretty easy to grasp that we exist in two dimensions of time, that we go through a linear progression,
Hmm.
yet we are seated with Christ at the right hand of the throne of God, right? We are immortal already because we have Christ, and we are on this side of immortality. But even though we die, we are immortal because death is temporary. And so I meditate on the notion that, okay, there's coming a threshold where we will acquire new capacities,
Hmm.
right? This fleshly body will be is immortal. Even if it dies, it will come back. And so the physical material that we are is eternal. But because we have Jesus as example, right? We Bible's very clear, we will become like him. What he is, we shall become. So he's the forerunner, the firstborn in that sense. That's what it means, like the first to have died and come back forever and never to die again. So he's the firstborn immortal. And so I like to meditate. What are some of those new capacities, right? What could they be? My creative mind. Uh, and so obviously, Jesus, I get hung up on some of these things, like Jesus walking on water was not a new capacity that he got, because and it's like, well, he didn't change. Like, he could still walk on water after he resurrected because he walked on water before he resurrected, right? That's a before, right? But Jesus also never sinned, and so he, I think, always had the capacities that we will acquire, if that makes sense, right? He
Okay.
never had sin that would suppress any of his capacities, and so that's why he could exercise those things even prior to the death and resurrection. But for us, it's only after we get our new bodies. So, what are some of the capacities that Jesus has that we will have? And I think one of them potentially is to be able to revisit our history, our own personal history, right? That
Oh,
we, as a human, as a human in God's creation, we are immortal, except we had a beginning point, right? That's the differentiation. God had no beginning point. Jesus had no beginning point. His physical body had a beginning point, but he came down to inhabit that body. So Jesus didn't have a beginning point. So that's how he's different from us. He's immortal, no beginning and no end, but we are immortal with a beginning and no end. And
hmm.
so our entire existence was ordained by God, planned by God. And then at some point we'll acquire capacities. I think we'll be able to go back and vividly revisit every moment of our personal history. And if that's the case,
So
it
this is more than just I can think back and remember. This is almost like going back and reliving it at some level, is what you're.
being there fully present, observing it,
Mm,
right? That's what I think is a
okay.
potential capacity, right? With that said, if that's true, what that means is right now, your future self is reliving this moment and observing it, right? We have two sides to our brain, and we think like we're in dialogue with ourselves constantly. I think one of those voices in our head is us revisiting in Christ.
Hmm.
Anyway, this is just that speculation, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I had always, so it is clear that this physical world is not the eternal state. I mean, your comment about Jesus walking on water, there's part of that where I put into his divine attributes that he just transcends the physical. Um, there's a little bit different flavor to what you're talking about there, in that I'm not going to be able to articulate it well, but it's like we're both places at the same time, if you will. And I guess I'd always kind of just assumed that I have some version of time, and I'm just going to be moving through time. The time may be a little bit different when I get to the eternal state, but I'm still on that single time trajectory. That's an interesting question. I've not actually thought about that in depth, except to know the two things that stand out to me is that, one, time is a created quantity. So the bizarre concept in my mind with that is that I think of time as fundamental. It's like, how could you exist without time? And that's actually a created quantity in which we live in that sense. Constraint may not be the right word, but it's not, if God is timeless, there's no constraint to where he is, what he is, whereas time is a constraint on what I can do in that sense. But then there's also, in the eternal state, whether it's something very much like Earth or the universe, or something very different in the new heavens and new earth, that we are fundamentally physical beings. We will have a physical and a spiritual. We're physical and spiritual all the time, not just here on earth. And then we're going to be spirits floating around heaven. So,
Right. And I'm glad you hit on that, because, you started that by saying, it's evident that the physical world is not the eternal, right? The second law of thermodynamics, right? Things are degrading, things are breaking down, except in living organisms, right? For some reason, they are regenerative, or we don't understand why life is life, but we do know life is, and that it can grow and increase. And that's something that's given to it's like the miraculous. Like God can sustain something that we think is going to degrade forever and ever. God can make it permanent. I'm not saying that this is all conjecture and speculation.
That's an interesting point. Just because there's a degradation in the amount of energy or whatever, that doesn't mean it can't also be eternal. That requires us thinking outside I get where you're going with that. I've got to think
tools that you use every day. Sorry, I'm just throwing things at you.
Well, yeah, that some of those things are related to, if you've got a finite quantity or finite entity, that if it's degrading over time, there will be an end to it. If it's infinite, maybe not. So there's a whole slew of really interesting, probably unsolvable this side of heaven problems that arise from that. So,
well, it's again one of the other kind of notions that I may have run. I think I may have run this by you before. Is that the decay rate? Is that what it's called? The second law of thermodynamics is like there's a decay rate. Is that
not so much a rate? It's just all the second law of thermodynamics says is that there's usable energy and unusable energy. Actually, it's related to the amount of entropy, and entropy, disorder and order, usable energy, unusable energy. But what it amounts to is that there are, in a low entropy system, there's lower number of ways the matter could be and still be in the same state. Whereas in a high entropy system, there's lots of different ways. And the way that practically works out in terms of our looking at it is that the amount of usable energy is decreasing, or the amount of order in the universe is decreasing. So it's a statistical property, not a property of an individual atom or anything like that.
Did you get that, kids? Are you taking notes? There's going to be a quiz in 3 minutes. In 3 minutes. What?
But the amount of usable energy in the universe is going down. That's a
okay.
Pretty
succinct. So
without
new energy being introduced, it is dissipating, or is disappearing. Yeah. The amount of energy in the universe. So that fact in itself it seems, right, in my limited understanding, that could be reversed or stopped, right? That could be halted at some point, not based on the principles that we understand, but when this idea first occurred to me, and this is probably obviously an imperfect metaphor for it, but magnetic north changes, right? isn't Magnor? And I know it's because of the molten,
Mhm.
whatever the makeup of the molten core is. That's kind of shifting all the time, and you
Mhm.
can't really predict when it happens. But it seems like in the physical universe that we live in, something like magnetic north is one of those constants that never changes, but it does change. So that opened up my thought. I'm like, oh, maybe some of these other, fixed
Mhm.
things are not so fixed, and certainly in God's, capacity, the decay rate, which it's not necessarily decay rate, but that could be halted or reversed and become a replenishment rate.
Right.
So just
Well,
speculation.
you're in good company. I mean, people have talked about whether the speed of light might be changing, not in a way for the old Earth, young Earth problem, but
Right, right.
if you it may very well be that these things we see as physical constants, when you look out on big enough scales, are not as constant as we think. And so, so that idea is out there. And even,
Right.
dark energy, that was one of the thoughts, that dark energy has this certain property right now, but it may be that can reverse or something else. Just in lack of full knowledge of what's going on, it might be. So we do know how the second law of thermodynamics works here, but it may be on long enough time scales, on big enough distance scales, that it works differently. That's an idea out there, and that's not an unphysical way of looking at things.
Mm. Well, I was almost going to title this episode um, Explaining Time in 30 Minutes.
Right.
Getting to the bottom of all of it in 30 minutes. No. Um,
More like spending 30 minutes hopping around talking about
all
different
right.
related to time. That's not a good title because it's too long.
All right. Well, what are you up to right now in your life? Tell me, what's the progression of your UCLA work and all that?
So we are flying our balloon experiment in December. So we are getting ready to ship everything down to Antarctica and get it set up and ready to go. And so I'm kind of
Do you get to go to Antarctica?
I get to go to Antarctica. So I'm getting uh,
I was
physicals and all that sort of stuff taken care of to do that. I get to go weeks. So
December what? December what?
well, it flies in December. I'm going down in November to get things set up and ready to go. But
So you'll be
but
there for the flight as well. You'll be there
I
ahead of time.
I will be there getting the flight set up and ready to go. But
Can you take a +1?
no, it was very clear about that. But
And I wouldn't be your +1 if you
I
could
was
anyway.
talking with someone else who had actually been to Antarctica and the place where I'm going to be, and he said there's penguins and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's exciting. I'm like, get a picture of a penguin. That would just be kind of cool. So
Penguins are only in Antarctica and not at the other pole.
I did know that. So
It's
there's no land up at the other pole. Antarctica is an actual landmass, whereas
But
the
there's polar bears. There's polar bears at the other pole. Wait. There's walrus. So we tend to know these animals that inhabit frozen tundra. Like we'll see them all together, but there's some that are only at the South Pole and some that are only at the North Pole, and they've never met. And
yeah,
I don't remember if it's polar bears or walruses. And penguins have never seen each other.
yeah, no. What do you mean? Movies aren't always accurate in some of the little scientific details. Come on, Michael, you got to get that straightened out. You work over in that field.
Speaking of Hollywood, impressing things into people's minds that give them false impressions. Most Westerns were filmed in around Tucson, like southern Arizona.
Okay.
And there's a line in the, in the environment, right? How you have different climates as you go further north and you go further south to get warmer. So there's this cutoff line where those saguaro cactuses, the ones with the long arms that stick out, those we see those in Westerns, right? And we think, every desert's got those things, but it's very isolated to very specific region, southern Arizona and part of northern Mexico. It's the only place that has saguaro cactuses. But
Yep.
because Hollywood filmed all of their Westerns there, everybody thinks saguaro cactuses are in every desert everywhere. And it's just not.
No,
right?
it is fun because that's where, when I was in graduate school, the telescope I worked on was a telescope down in southern Arizona. So I'd fly into Tucson, drive south of there, and you're driving by these big saguaro cactus, and I'm like, this is so cool because I've seen quite a bit of the country, but I'd never seen those until I went to southern Arizona, and
It's the
lo and
only
behold,
place
they're
there.
all over the place down there. That's fun.
Hollywood, you
Yeah.
know, convincing people of all kinds of stuff. Well, I want to fix that. That's why I'm here. All right. Love you, brother. Good to see you, my friend.
It'll be good to see you too.
Bye, everybody. God is in control. End stream.